afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for an exploration of the architectures of hospitality. My name is Joel Ong, and I bring you greetings from Sensorium, the Center of Digital Art and Technology, as well as the School of the Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York, where I am a faculty member. Before we start today, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and to recognize their longstanding relationships with these territories on which York campuses are located that precedes the establishment of the university. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, and we acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant and agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Today's notion of hospitality is very poignant to me because I recognize that as a first-generation settler of Asian descent, I have adopted many of the benefits and welcome of this society as foreign and uninvited guest. And like many of us, I am very grateful to have this opportunity to work and raise my family in the communities that have grown in these treaty lands. Today, we also acknowledge that the virtual networks on which our activities and gatherings are sited is a product of Silicon Valley and Zoom's headquarters that are located on Muwekma Ohlone territory, and that the Zoom website through which our credentials are accessed for this meeting is hosted on a server that occupies Kanoi land in Ashburn, Virginia. Now, as a member of Public's editorial collective, I'm delighted to welcome you all today to the second event in a dynamic month-long series of online conversations celebrating the release of the latest issue of Public and extending the journal's interdisciplinary exploration of the currencies of hospitality. This series brings together Public 61 contributors to expand on their projects together and with you. In this, the series mobilizes and amplifies the publication, positioning it as a relay for the exchange of ideas and a vector for attentive engagement, open debate, and speculation around questions of hospitality. But first, I'll say a few words about Public. Founded in Toronto in 1988, Public is a biannual interdisciplinary journal focusing on visual art. The journal is led by an editorial committee and supported by the Canada Council of the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, the School of the Arts, Media, Performance and Design at York University, and private donors and supporters. To learn more about Public and its previous issues, please visit www.publicjournal.ca. Today's event is co-hosted by the Penny W. Stamp School of the Art and Design at the University of Michigan and the University of Florida School of Architecture. We thank them sincerely for their collaboration. And now I'd like to introduce Sylvie Fortin, a fellow member of Public's editorial committee, the editor of Public 61, and the architect of this month's series of conversations. Sylvie Fortin is an independent curator, researcher, critic, and editor based between Montreal, New York, and Omaha, Nebraska, where she is curator in residence since 2019 at Burmese Center for Contemporary Arts. She was executive and artistic director of La Biennale de Montreal from 2013 to 2017, executive director and editor of Art Papers in Atlanta from 2004 to 2012, and curator of Mani-Darsh 5, the 5th Quebec City Biennale in 2010. Her reviews have been published in numerous periodicals, including Art Forum International, Art Papers, C Magazine, and Flash Art International, and her essays have appeared in many catalogs, readers, and anthologies. She's also the editor of PASS, the journal of the International Biennale Association. So I'll hand this over to Sylvie right now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joel, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Can you guys see me? Just want to make sure. Yes, perfect. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and land acknowledgements. Thanks also to Carmen Victor, Public Journal's managing editor, for her assistance today. And welcome to each and every one of you, and thank you for joining the conversation today. Please post your comments in the chat section. And give us, also tell us where you are listening from. This way we'll have a sense of the community that we're forming over the next hour and a half. And so I'm presently in New York. Where are you? Much like the publication itself, this month-long series of talks is an experiment. We all talk a lot about care and about slowing down, but at times that's quite abstract. As a curator and an editor, care and slowing down have meant revisiting all the relations that make up my practice. Too often, after an exhibition opens or a publication is printed, they are treated as finished products, as if all of the thinking and sharing had already happened. Done and delivered, and on to the next project. We rarely step back to assess what actually happens in the show through the publication, except when we have to write a report and then, what language we use. To care and to slow down means to pay attention to what we've produced, to let it be what it is, instead of limiting it to what we thought it would be or what we hoped it would be. And to do this together and with others, which is to say to recast our projects, not as products, but as relay and as platform for further and further engagement and ongoing learning. And that's what we're trying to do this month. The session will have 3 parts. Each speaker will present their work and ideas for 15 minutes. Hailey will present first, followed by Sara Swain and Irina Aristarkhova. I'll then moderate a short conversation with and between the panelists, and the last 15 minutes are reserved for you. Again, please share your comments and questions in the chat section, and we'll be happy to relay as many of them as possible. The session today is being recorded. This includes the chat and the Q&A. The recording will be published on our YouTube channel. So if you have a question and later realize that you don't want your name to appear, please email us and we'll edit that part out. We'll keep your question, we'll just make sure your name doesn't appear. Today's session brings together 3 scholars who've contributed new texts to Public 61. Over the past year, I've had the distinct pleasure of fellow traveling with them through the editorial process. I was just thinking this morning, it'd be a fascinating question to talk about editorial hospitality. So maybe that's another conversation. Hailey, Sara Swain, and Irina Aristarkhova join us today from the Florida coast, from Newfoundland, and from Ann Arbor, respectively. Our conversation will expand upon their text to continue our exploration of the architectures of hospitality in cities, camps, and the cinematic frame. On behalf of everyone in the audience, I'm delighted to welcome Charlie, Sara, and Irina. Hailey is professor of architecture and distinguished teaching scholar in the School of Architecture at the University of Florida in Gainesville. A registered architect, Hailey has received numerous awards and grants, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and a Graham Foundation grant. Is the author of 6 books, including Camps, A Guide to 21st Century Space, published by MIT in 2009, Design Build with Jersey Devil, Princeton Architectural Press in 2016, and coming up, I guess on April 1st, The Porch, Meditations on the Edge of Nature, coming out of University of Chicago Press. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Charlie.
Right. Thank you, Sylvie, and thank you, Joel. And thanks to everyone who's put this event together. Great. Thanks, Sylvie.
Just screen share, just one moment.
Okay.
Here we go.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Great. So I'll start by introducing a place called Slab City, and then I'll unpack some additional background on the land. I begin the article describing how you might arrive in Slab City. The first thing you feel when you visit Slab City in the summer is the heat. The second is the unease. Both make you realize instantly that you're in fact a visitor, one who might not be welcome. To walk along Slab City's grid of roads is to hear your presence announced in footfalls crunching and scraping across the grit and gravel known as superstition gravelly sand. Next slide, please. Slab City is an encampment of artists, retirees, anarchists, and homeless people on East Mesa in California's Colorado desert. It endures in the resolve of its residents, but it exists because the land has remained public. This 1 square mile fragment of sand and gravel is a residue of the land ordinance's gridding of the American West. It's a camp that raises the ongoing question of how land that is environmentally inhospitable, yet relatively hospitable in its public status, might host practices of self-determination, self-regulated community, and national identity. The land has been occupied over time. First, it was a fishing camp of the land's indigenous population, middens of shells, particularly where the canal construction has excavated them, can be seen near Slab City. Next slide, please. The shellfish were harvested from the ancient lake and then also the extension of the Bay of California that carved the edge of East Mesa. Now, sediment below sea level hosts the industrialized agriculture of the Imperial Valley. I think the next 2 slides will show the first Bay of California and give you a sense of the scale of the industrialized agriculture. I think one back, sorry, Sylvie. So after the land ordinance, which I'll talk about in a minute, the next phase was Camp Dunlap in the 1940s. So that's the image here. Then we can go back to the image of the camp. Slab City streets and its eponymous slabs are the remains of the temporary military facility that hosted Marines training for some of the Second World War's most challenging desert terrains. If we can go 2 slides forward, please. On March 5th, 1946, the US government decommissioned the camp. And soon after, migrant farm workers began to camp on the slabs. And I think the next slide will show the slabs, one of the empty slabs. And that's photographs of Slab City that I'm including were taken by the Irish photographer, Donovan Wiley. And the migrant workers were there harvesting creosote as they moved across the desert, wedged between the burgeoning agricultural production of the Imperial Valley to the west and the 500,000 acres of the Chocolate Mountain Aerial Gunnery Range to the east. And in the 1970s, Slab City became an RV and snowbird destination. A graffitied sentry box left over from Camp Dunlap marks your arrival to Slab City. Stumbling through creosote and across a lattice of disused roads, you walk into the ongoing experiment of a permanent camp. You're also walking through ghosts of American land policy. Though it is ostensibly public land, those who live here have claimed and occupied it as their own. Though off-grid, they are camping in the grid. And this section of the grid, a residual fragment of public domain, hosts them in a tenuous yet enduring bond. Over 7 decades, Slab City has developed a sense of community that is based on its members' resilience and shared valuing of freedom, which has formed a bond between community and land. If we can go to the next slide, please. So to back up, on May 20th, 1785, the 6th Confederation Congress met in New York City's City Hall to pass the ordinance that set the rules for surveying and dividing the new nation's western lands. Known simply as the Land Ordinance, the resulting document divided land into square townships, each of which was further parsed into 36 1 square mile sections. The grid casts a normative, though invisible and error-prone net over the land. And the Land Ordinance Committee saw the grid as a tool that fostered democratic openness. It would serve as an equalizer, clearing the way for, if not, in their mind, guaranteeing liberty. But it was a genocidal and colonizing tool. It shamelessly ignored indigenous people's sovereignty and occupancy. The Land Ordinance of 1785 reserved Section 16, the central square mile block that you can see in this grid, of each township for, quote, free public common schools. And in 1848, Section 36, the far corner of the township, was added. The Section 16 and 36 allotments amounted to nearly 70 million acres of public land in the Midwest and West. And most of these lands were readily sold to support public schools, but as the grid reached further west, it met expansive and rugged terrain, and many of these square mile sections fell across remote deserts and inaccessible mountains. Very different from the productive soil and hospitable environment of the Mississippi Valley and the Central Plains. This land challenged the original Jeffersonian ideals in terms of both egalitarian division and basic communal value. In 1853, the US Congress officially granted 5.5 million acres of sections 16 and 36 to California. Next slide, please. To this day, the state does not know exactly how many acres of school lands it still owns, but the estimates are right around 500,000 acres. And next slide, please. This is the checkerboard squares that the California State Lands Commission has documented. The realities of geography challenge not only the ordinance's original ideals, but also its assumptions about the grid layout's precision. Surveyors typically pitch their tents on the land itself, but where that land limited accessibility, some surveys estimated the system of townships at a distance. Next slide, please. Early maps label large swaths of the Colorado desert as, quote, unexplored instrumentally. Errors of as much as 2 miles have been found in the lines drawn through the desert near Slab City. Next slide, please. I came to understand these difficulties firsthand in my own search for the surveyor's benchmark that anchors the northeastern corner of the Section 36 that hosts Slab City. Hours of navigating spotty GPS signals and sweeping away drifts of sand finally resulted in locating the circular monument tucked under a clump of galeta grass. While the overlay was a grid of precise, presumably hospitable and widely, if not infinitely extensible space, the underlay is the land itself. Next slide, please. Where the land prevented conventional forms of productivity, like farming or readily accessible mining, it also resisted the smooth logic of the grid. There was a disconnect between the designation as public domain offered and what the land as arid desert denied. How to occupy this in between. In the case of Western lands generally and the leftover Section 36 lands in particular, camping served as a liminal practice between what had been conceived as hospitable but proved to be inhospitable, and between what was mandated as public but soon forgotten and left to nature. Camps are labile practices, and camping at Slab City works between multiple territories, between public status and individual claims of ownership, and between leftover military infrastructure and the desert's natural entropy. Camps make visible, often hidden situations and latent overlaps of systems. The camp at Slab City indicates, if not manifests, this interstice between public status and harsh nature, offering a perspective on the host-guest relation in places that have lingered without oversight and with very little management. Slab City draws on different models and practices of camping. Long-term visitors areas, known as LTVAs, are vast zones where people can camp in recreational vehicles or even tents for extended periods of time for a relatively small fee. Here, federal policy and rules link recreation to stewardship. Slab City is similar to these long-term areas, but its land is technically owned and administered by the state, so it lacks the overlay of federal management. Second, boondocking taps into infrastructure of big box stores, parking lots for overnight camping stays. Walmart is the most common. Slab City similarly occupies the infrastructure of the abandoned military camp. And then dry camping. Dry camps are off the grid. Their dryness means water and electricity connections are not available. The dryness of this camp is a challenging reality for those with limited economic resources. But Slab City is not corporate owned, and it falls outside Bureau of Land Management's administrative domain. And so it takes the freedom of boondocking, what has also been called independent parking, to its temporal and geographical limits. Next slide, please. A fourth is municipal camping. These are photographs taken by Marion Post Wolcott in the Sarasota Trailer Park in 1941. As Michelle Sayre notes in The Parasite, quote, hosts and parasites are always in the process of passing by, being sent away, touring around, walking alone. They exchange places in a space soon to be defined. To Sayre's process of parasitic movement, I've added camping. In Slab City, though it's still worked out, recalls an earlier relations. In the 1920s and 30s, as automobility expanded the range for a growing group of recreational campers, American cities developed municipal camps for camping tourists. In one sense, the state of California is an unwitting host. While Slab City began as a largely invisible camp, it later became a settlement the state tried to ignore, and is now a permanent camp impossible to overlook, whether in terms of its increasing publicity, its appearance in movies, its proximity to the Coachella Festival, or news items linking it to illegal activity, or simply its problem of accumulated garbage. Next slide, please. This is the site Marcel and Lise have identified as their winter home, winter camp and home. You see their names inscribed on the newspaper box. And while the residents of municipal camps are eventually expelled to the periphery of cities, campers at Slab City already occupy the edges of geography between Imperial Valley and the Gunnery Range and administration as a remote Section 36. The land and its residents have already been evicted. They both occupy public land where campers stay for extended periods of time. For many, the camp is not simply a seasonal escape from cold weather, it is their surrogate home. Whether seasonal or permanent campers, Slab City residents have made the desert their home, and they have a sense of ownership of the land. Unlike LTVA camps or boondocking, it is not merely a place where they park, it is a permanent camping place. And at Slab City, to occupy a piece of land, whether a slab or a patch of gravel, is essentially to claim ownership. The same applied to municipal camps, where slabbers might lay out a row of tires or a line of bottles. Campers in Sarasota Trailer Park, next slide please, arrange shells to demarcate the edges of their domestic territory. Marion Post Walcott's extraordinary photographs from the early 1940s show municipal campers proudly sitting behind shells arranged to spell their family's name. Slabbers identify their camping plots with signage as well. It might be a name carved into a piece of wood, an address spray painted on corrugated panel, or simply the word occupy. And in the recent census—
3 minutes, Charlie.
Okay, great, thank you. In the recent census, 77 residents of Slab City claimed, quote, free and clear ownership of the land, even though it remains resolutely public. So towards the end of the article, I talk about super studios, photo montages, and depictions of families camping in the gridded desert. They wrote, quote, there will be no further need for cities or castles. There will be no further reason for roads or squares. Every point will be the same as any other, excluding a few deserts or mountains, which are in no way habitable. So having chosen a random point on the map, we'll be able to say my house will be here for 3 days, 2 months, or 10 years. Residents of Slab City, next slide, please. Residents of Slab City are camping in the desert and they're camping in the grid, and have continued to live in just that exclusion that Super Studio mentioned. Quote, a few deserts or mountains that are in no way habitable. On their own grid square, resolutely lodged in his inhospitable desert without infrastructure or services. They are inhabiting the uninhabitable. And history may have hidden and obscured those original claims for a limitless expanse of hospitable space, but fragments of land like Section 36 blocks in Slab City remain as physical evidence of both the limitations of such systems and the possibilities for alternative practices to occupy land. So to wrap up, as Hannah Higgins wrote, quote, the homogenizing dimension of the grid myth begs for reversal. And in many ways, Slab City transforms the land ordinance's grid and reverses how hospitable space is approached and maintained as a public condition that is practiced. Inhabitants of the grid, those who in Slab City's case also parasite the relation between the grid and the land, redefine its meaning. It is as if one future of public space is hidden in plain sight. Thank you. Thanks for sharing the PowerPoint for me too, Sylvie.
My pleasure. Now we will stop sharing, and bravo, thank you. And it is my pleasure now to welcome Sara Swain. Sara is a writer, researcher, and educator based in Toronto. She holds a PhD in communication and culture from York and Ryerson universities and has published essays on female gross-out comedy, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Twin Peaks. Her many years of moonlighting in the service industry have helped her think through the environmental, collaborative, and performative aspects of hospitality. She continues to explore these issues in her current research, where she examines the ways in which non-human animals are implicated in the conception and materialization of media technologies, because they make substantial contributions to the supportive infrastructure of human society and culture. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. I would love to say hello to everybody and thank you for being here. I come to you from St. John's, Newfoundland, the island of Newfoundland in particular, which is the original ancestral homeland of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. The Beothuk have all been wiped out, their way of life, their language, their culture, and I often think of them as Newfoundland struggles to define itself in this inhospitable granite rock. I think that there's been much that's been lost, so I just want to make that acknowledgement. And thank you to Sylvie and to Carmen and to Public and to the Stamp School of Art and Design and the University of Florida School of Architecture for helping promote this recent issue of Public. Very happy to be a part of it. So I'll begin now with, so the paper I wrote was, the essay I wrote is called Feral Hospitality, Thinking Outside the House with Kedi. Now the kind of catalyst, I suppose, for this paper came actually from Jordan Peterson. So one thing I have to thank him for is when he published this book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos, he used for rule number 12, he said, stop and pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. And I found this particularly vexing and infuriating as I felt it illustrated everything that I think is wrong with how we approach animals. First of all, it's very, disrespectful to just stop and pet a cat. You need to kind of approach a cat carefully and let it come to you. Maybe it doesn't want to be pet. Maybe it wants to be pet in a certain way. But there was also the sense that to turn towards animals is a turn away from the human, away from things that matter. That to pet a cat is an antidote to chaos and not, in fact, a confrontation of chaos or an ethical encounter or a political encounter. And so it was in the shadow of this vexing summoning of the cat that I wanted to think about how we might be able to approach animals and confront chaos rather than shy away from it or use them as a kind of therapeutic salve. So the cat as a kind of conduit for a more interesting conversation about the world and our relationship to it. So the film that forms the basis of my essay is called Kedi. It's a Turkish word for cat. And it's a documentary about Turkish street cats, in particular in Istanbul. So these are not house cats. These are not pets in the traditional sense. They don't really belong to anybody. They belong to the city. So I think they belong to the city not as some kind of birthright because they are just there, but they belong there through a process by which the place and its people have accommodated them through its history, its culture, customs, habits, as well as the city's own natural and human-made topography. It's a prime location. It's got a prime location right on the Bosphorus River. And then to consider, the physical design of its architecture and how these all kind of work together to provide invitational accommodations to support the cat's existence and its ability to thrive in Istanbul in particular. Istanbul is kind of known for its cats. They are ubiquitous in Istanbul. And so I'm using this just for fun here. The Taksim Metro cat, known to own the metro, just kind of makes it his home by, sleeping wherever he wants, going wherever he pleases, takes great pleasure in this particular space. And then, cats are able to pop up anywhere in Istanbul, like this fashion show, year-end fashion show for a fashion school. This cat just kind of popped up on the catwalk and started swatting at a model. So this is an example of the ways in which the cats are ubiquitous. there. And I wanted to explain why. Why are they there? And I wanted to say that it's not a coincidence that they're there. You know, it's not just, oh, well, you know, people like cats, so the cats are there, or they've just arbitrarily found a place to thrive. But there might be something more significant going on, a deeper relationship that is allowing them to thrive. You know, that there's something about the architecture, the performances, the culture, the customs that allow for this to take place. And so this film really resonated with me in part because it reminded me, especially in the film, we see a lot of people feeding the cats and providing accommodations for them outside of the house. And it reminded me of my experience of cats when I was a child growing up in St. John's. I would often go to the community where my family is from and visit my grandmother. And she, in this community, there was all of these cats. They belonged to nobody. They had originally belonged to an old bachelor that lived in a shack across the road, who didn't have much, but he had his cats. And when he passed on, his cats remained, and they made themselves at home there. And the community sort of took over, but no one really kind of adopted them or brought them inside. You know, they lived on the land. And every day it was part of the daily ritual to, after meals, you would go out and scrape your plate in the garden and the cats would come running. And so, I really took a lot of pleasure in, participating in those feedings and having these kinds of associations with the cats. This one in particular on the left is, I named Blue-Eyed Beauty on account of her cataract that she had. And so I was thinking about this, what is this form of hospitality? Like, what is that? And, to see it again represented in Kedi made me think I need a name for it. So I've coined the term feral hospitality to describe this kind of welcome without welcoming inside. And I like to use the term feral because I feel it is a good way to bypass the dualities that we are so often accustomed to when it comes to issues of hospitality. We don't have, it's not host versus guest, human versus animal, inside versus outside, culture versus nature. It's a kind of a third space, a kind of in between, where more kinds of accommodations are possible because they're non-proprietary and delocalized and not anchored to particular roles or places. I feel that the house itself is very circumscribed and offers a very scarce and competitive form of hospitality. And that, so there's a way to kind of offer and receive accommodations outside the house, ones that are always shifting and changing. So it really emphasizes the relationality, the mutuality, and the reciprocity of what's going on. And it's itinerant, it's performative, it's a kind of welcoming that fills in the gaps between people, animals, and places. And so I wanted to look at Kedi, the film, as a film that embodies feral hospitality as much as it depicts it. So it is showing these activities of hospitality, but at the same time, it embodies it through its process and its style, to kind of extend the hospitality, extend the accommodation outside the house. And this, I would say that the film is very much, the style of the film offers a cat-like reality, one that, exceeds the human understanding or knowledge of that. So that, cats they're shown to be part of a world, a kind of singular presence, individual presence that, has its own relationship to the landscape. That is something that humans can't fully access. So we see glimpses of that in this particular film. And these are these aren't just about cats in Istanbul, but about all of these individual cats. So Seda Turan, the director, said she got something like their permission by, only filming cats that wanted to be followed. And, these are all named, and all of their names, as you can see, sort of suggest something about the cat's personality. And perhaps they have different names in different neighborhoods, but there is something singular and specific about these particular cats. So I just want to show a quick clip of from the film, just so you have a sense of what it is I'm looking at and trying to make a case for, about the ways in which the film, in highlighting, a practice of feral hospitality, shows us the kind of space, the ways in which we might accommodate cat presence, and see it as a conduit to think about the world rather than our own kind of narcissistic therapeutic contemplation. So let's see here. Got
Sarah, we cannot see the clip.
Okay.
We can only see your PowerPoint or your screen at the moment.
Okay. All right. So thank you. So let me just stop sharing screen and then share it again, maybe. Thank you. So that's why I need to select it. Okay. Thank you. All right. So let me just go back here.
Yıl oldu saymadım köyden göçeli, mevsimler geldi geçti görüşmeyeli. Hiç haber göndermedin o günden beri, yoksa bana küstün mü, unuttun mu beni? Dün yine seni andım, gözlerim doldu, o tatlı günlerimiz bir anı oldu. Ayrılık geldi başa, katlanmak gerek. Seni çok çok özledim, arkadaşım eşek. Yaban tayları çayırda tepişiyor mu? Çilli horoz kedilerle dövüşüyor mu? Sarı kız minik uzayı sütten kesti mi? Kuzularla oğlanlar sevişiyor mu? Uzun son bir kez salla.
Bayağı avcı gibi yani. Önceden böyle tripleri yoktu tabii.
And that's 3 minutes, Sarah.
Okay. I hope it was clear from the clip that I showed, sorry about the technical details there, that the film is able to create space for cat presence and cat livingness, and something about the cat's own experience and relationship to Istanbul that is outside of the human, its relationship to the human. And it's able to do this in cinema specifically because you can see that it's using the film language as opposed to using, instead of having a human have to narrate and explain what's happening, we understand that this is Sari the cat who is, hustling and trying to earn a living on the streets of Istanbul. So there is this kind of throughout the film an attention to the performativity of this kind of hospitality, a recognition of the space that the cat occupies as a kind of subject, and then the human as another kind of subject, and they're performing across this difference, a sort of mutual reciprocity, mutual enjoyment of each other and care. Then there's also these kinds of manners, customs, and habits that are shared as well, a kind of cat and human communication. Duman, for example, makes a swimming motion on the window to let, the delicatessen workers know that he's hungry. He doesn't come inside. They understand, this is something, a language that they have built. Also can be seen in the architecture, like around the city, and the ways in which it has, whether intentionally or not, created a hospitable environment and a hospitable invitational space for them to kind of set up shop and, get around and, enjoy the space as well. And then historically, the Istanbul was also, it's on the Bosphorus River. There's a lot of ship traffic that comes through there. I'm just using this as one particular example. It's when, ship's cats, as they were known, would be taken on board ships, used not just as, mascots and company, but also were there to kind of protect textiles and food stores for mice. And so they became this kind of important part of ship and seafaring culture. And sometimes these cats would get off the ships and settle on land, beginning with, the sewers in downtown Istanbul. So this is just an example of the ways in which the history, the culture, the architecture, the topography, the customs, all of these things work together to create a hospitable and accommodating environment to support cat existence. And that, this shouldn't be taken for granted as, oh, it's just an arbitrary fact that they ended up there, that there is something more important going on. And that it is not, in fact, a coincidence that the cats are there, and that this allows us to think about cats as a conduit to thinking about world building, homemaking, and the kind of the labor, the energies, the materials, the architectures that are involved in supporting that existence. And that, cats are something that, they're not just there for us, but they exist as part of a world, and this film shows us that. So thank you very much. That's all I will say.
Thank you, Sara. And now I'd like to welcome Irina Aristarkhova. She's the author of a book that's been very important to many of us called Hospitality of the Matrix, Philosophy, Biomedicine, and Culture, published by Columbia University Press in 2012 and published in a Russian translation in 2017. And most recently, just last year, a book called Arrested Welcome, Hospitality in Contemporary Art. She teaches at the Penny W. Stamp School of Art and Design and the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Welcome, Irina.
Thank you. Start sharing my screen. Can you see that well?
Yep, we can see it.
Excellent. To figure out how to Hello. I acknowledge that the University of Michigan, named for Michigami, the world's largest freshwater system and located in the Huron River watershed, occupies the land stewarded by the three Fires people, who are the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations. I'm speaking today about my contribution to the special issue of Public, that is fully devoted to the topic of hospitality. Thank you, Sylvie Fortin and the team of Public for bringing us together, as well as my fellow authors who gave such interesting talks. My topic is the work of an architectural bureau, Moscow, founded by Julia Burdova and Olga Alexakova in 2004, and that since has become one of the most transformative and interesting architectural teams in Russia. In my article for the special issue, I argue that Bureau Moscow projects embody what I call a welcoming architecture. My interest in theory and practice of welcoming places, understood more broadly as a relation between hospitality and space, has brought me to consider closer the relation between hospitality and contemporary art, architecture, and design. In this new text for Public 61, I argue that welcoming architecture is not primarily a specific object or a product, but an effect that comes as a result of architects, urban planners, and designers having a vision for and politics of welcome. Welcoming architecture is an effect on a body, on an environment, on animals, on plants, on air, and on politics of a specific location. Bureau Moscow's reconstruction of Triumphальная Square in the city center of Moscow is my blueprint to show that due to those parameters, welcoming architecture is affected and affected by Burdova and Alexakova on a much broader and politically significant scale, showing us what an ambitious, difficult practice architecture could be. In this case, Bureau Moscow envisions a new body that feels welcomed in a city that has been for a long time frozen. Bureau Moscow stands apart because of a careful combination of architectural genealogical methodology of their projects, their ecological approach to site, and their unique novel approach to the body, where city dwellers and their spaces are transformed together. I invite those who are interested in this approach to watch their recent lecture. A link is posted in the chat for you at the Faculty of Architecture of the University of Hong Kong. Burdova and Alexakova are creators, I think, and visionaries who assemble and make space and invite our bodies to feel and become anew, happy and free in the city of Moscow. And I write about why this is such a revolutionary invitation. Because this feeling of being welcomed is so specific to each situation, political, cultural, and personal, I write that welcoming architecture is contextual. That is why it would be a mistake to consider Bureau Moscow projects on the same plane as similar looking structures elsewhere. This is, and this is not about swings. What's transformative on the level of the body in Moscow right now might be a commonplace or out of place and do nothing in a different space. What it is for you might not be the same as what it is for you. What it is for you is not the same what it is for me. But communal trends, historical trends, what has been included and excluded are also present in our individual histories. To feel welcome, accepted, belonging, without the need to prove one's right to be in a particular place or time, to show documents, to fly high up in the air, free from gravity, literal gravity of this earth and metaphorical gravity of the Russian revolutionary past, represented on the square by the monumental sculpture of the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, and the present, that is politically less free today than it was yesterday. To feel belonging, as in Russian language, to be svoy rather than чужой, in one's own city as a free body to move, to take, to inhabit. Bureau Moscow has a quotation on their website presenting their philosophy. Lina Bobardi, who herself was a stranger and foreigner, as an Italian-born architect living and practicing in Brazil, is quoted by them as writing, Architecture and architectural freedom are above all a social issue that must be seen from inside the political structure, not from outside of it. This is here my last slide. Levinas and Derrida, who for me were the key philosophers of hospitality to start thinking with, think against, and think after, when considering what hospitality of space has been and could be in the future, wrote that ultimately hospitality is about the feeling of being at home with oneself. Note that this is a feeling, a fleeting moment of knowing and seeking, capturing that feeling and missing it. That feeling comes from memories of being welcomed into this world. For these philosophers, it comes from the feminine, the maternal, which is for them a domestic sphere, from one's childhood, from a sense of that courtyard where one played with childhood friends, from a parental enveloping of one's body tucked in bed at night. I questioned this essentializing tendency in hospitality theory of dividing it into feminine and masculine, domestic and communal and political, while at the same time affirmed the new practices of hospitality that transform it into a more inclusive, radical, and less essentialized tradition that I believe the special issue also seeks to affirm. In Bureau Moscow projects, the level is always one of specific embodiment, how a body moves, whether it is relaxed or tense, even unconsciously, how it occupies a space as belonging, or feels foreign and strange, even more our mind recognizes it as such. That feeling of being at home with oneself is important as it affirms, accepts, comforts on an embodied level of touch, smell, being with oneself as in being with others, as welcome despite of the frozen weather or politics. And I write also to acknowledge how hard it is for architects in Moscow to work toward that effect as they envision for us a new kind of welcome. As I'm looking at this picture, I would also like to acknowledge Rachel London, a former student at the University of Michigan who took all the pictures, which were except for the ones with police that were presented in this publication, as well as in my talk today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irina. And now I'd like to ask all the panelists to come back on camera. And I have some questions, but you probably have more urgent ones. So I'd like to open the floor to you, Sara, Charlie, and Irina for questions to each other.
Okay, just think. Charlie, I have a question for you. Can you,
Sure.
I think it's interesting that Slab City is a desert of all places, which is kind of seemingly the most inhospitable of all places. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what is the relationship to, I suppose I'm thinking also of Irina's talk and the way that she highlights that, you know, hospitality isn't so much about a place and it's not about specific architecture, but about the kind of the labor that enlivens that space. And so I wondered about the desert and the kinds of, I don't know, labors or activities that are used to, I don't know, enliven the land, the territory, I suppose. Not just the kind of the makeshift houses and trailers and things that people are making, but are, you know, what is the relationship to the land that's there? You know, there's no kind of public infrastructure. So what are, yeah, could you talk a little bit more about the kinds of processes that go into making the space more livable?
Yeah, so that's great question, because it is one of, it is an exceedingly inhospitable place. The visits that Donovan and I took out there, the temperature range, it never really got below 105 Fahrenheit. So the temperature alone is a huge issue. The remoteness of the site is also one that it sort of matches the inhospitability of the landscape with the opportunity to define the community in the way that the occupants want to define it. Some of the ways that that's happened is there's a communal gathering place called the Range, which serves as a kind of music venue. It serves as a social gathering place. It's certainly improvised. I mean, it's built out of salvage materials. It's built also out of a lot of what the industries around Slab City offer. Everything from wooden pallets to some of the shipping containers for the solar panels that are being, the arrays of solar panels that are being built nearby. There's a really important communication network as well, mainly through signage, as well as other ways of leaving messages. Everything from kind of yoga on the slabs, daily morning sessions of yoga, to people providing water. There's a truck that drives around, each day and delivers water. So as makeshift as it is, it's sort of tempered that inhospitability of the place with quite innovative ways of making a place. Really, ultimately, it's not in any way welcoming like what Irina was talking about. I've seen Moscow's work, and it's quite extraordinary how the firm addresses the specific, Irina, as you mentioned, the specific situations of each project. It's extraordinary the way that welcoming, that the space welcomes its occupants. But yeah, thanks for the question, Sarah.
Well, I'll jump in with a question. One of the things that struck me about all three of your presentations, and Irina, you touched upon it, talking about hospitality as being at home with oneself, but it relates to a question of your textual or writerly strategy. So Irina, in your story, your story begins with an account of a surprise encounter in the city when you're bracing for cold and all of a sudden you're swept up by people in flight. So there's this really multisensorial locatedness that is enacted by the text, and it puts us there. Charlie, the same for you. I mean, your first paragraph makes us feel the heat and the unease, and your beautiful sentence of the footfalls crunching and scraping across the grit and gravel. So we can feel the dryness, we can feel the sound, we can feel this, the sun, we can feel the weight, the weariness. So it's really a fully, again, multisensorial embodiness of a certain now. And Sarah, for you, I think you introduce your presentation today with Jordan Peterson, but the text starts with your childhood memory. And again, super, embodied. It's a screen door, the sound of a screen door opening, and then the sound of silverware on a porcelain plate, and then the meowing of the cats. And so you can sort of, really be there in sharing that sort of very embodied point of view. So I guess my question is, can you talk about that as a textual strategy? Is that something that was consciously chosen to make the reader at home in the text? Or tell me about that idea.
Would anyone else like to go? I mean, I can go. Yeah, I think that was a very specific choice on my part, often because, in academic writing, I find it's hard to position oneself within it, and it's often kind of uncomfortable to talk about the personal in relation to the the intellectual, you know, the emotional. And I really did want to accentuate that personal relationship because it opened me up to caring a little bit more about about the topic, and yeah, foregrounded again that relationality, that relationship to place, to others in that place. And it's very important to situate oneself before you set out to do something. Otherwise, you're just kind of speaking in abstractions, which I feel kind of diminishes or undermines that that central relationship that gives you the ground to stand on. So I thought that would be a hospitable way to begin, is to kind of create some ground for myself so that I could, you know, explore, yeah, my subjects, so that we're kind of like we have as much ground for each other to kind of look across the divide and try to relate and make some kind of meaning. Because I think that's the relationship where meaning is created. So that's my thinking.
I can go next. Thank you for the question, Sylvie. Certainly, since I started, since I saw that Bro Moscow's projects and how others react to it, and having that personal reaction, certainly writing, especially for a foreign audience in English, becomes that strategy of both creating a certain mental space for people to connect to and appreciate the work. That again, as I mentioned, in terms of just images, if you show images, it's really hard to understand how one feels in that space. So one creates that mental space on the one hand, and on the other hand, to do some level of justice to what the work does, and to research that goes into what Sara is doing or what Charlie is doing. There is a lot of research behind feeling with the work, or being with the work more expansively than one's own personal encounter with it. And I wonder if for you also, like an architect, how does one create an objective reality without forgetting that we're all dealing with a very subjective, right, decisions? And that's why I'm mentioning that what it is for you might be different than what it is for me, but there are certainly communal and historical and political genealogies that we are situated in, and that we, language is one of those things that helps us to share. Thank you.
Here, I was just looking back at, I love that second image, the one that kind of puts us very close to the people on the swing, and you know, in the background is push the swing, and that moment to me also kind of gets to that welcoming in terms of an image in your piece, and for me, having visited Slab City for years, you know, the realization of how filled with stories it is, and trying to convey that, both, you know, academically, but also narratively, because it really is, each of those stories are interactions of climate, land, people, politics, and trying to convey that in its full sensibility and embodiment, something that I think for places like that, and really any place, is really important. And maybe it's also that idea of living in, trying to understand living in rather than living from a place, is something that I hope that the language and the way of telling the story works.
And I had another question. One of the other things that struck me was that we were all sort of invoking geometries. So we've got the grid, we've got the square, and the public square, and we have the frame. And I thought that was a really interesting a form that is sort of moving across all of your work, the works that you presented, as something to work, to think with and against in terms of practices of hospitality. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit about that so the geometry, that sort of form with borders, and how do we cross those?
Yeah, for me, just a kind of a quick response. I was really interested in how the grid can be broken in a few different ways, and sort of taking a cue from Hannah Higgins in her book. I don't know if y'all seen the grid book, where she looks not only at the history of the grid, but she takes it as a prompt to revisit that organizational method, whether it's in architecture or planning. So I was fascinated with that breaking of the grid. It's something that we talk about sometimes in architecture and architectural design, particularly in pedagogy, and how it's broken not only by those who live there and have adapted it and manipulated it, but also it's broken by the land, particularly the ecologies of the landscape and the you might say inhospitability of the landscape. So I was fascinated kind of on multiple ways, but particularly on that end of the geometry.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Sylvie. The geometry of it, or the idea of having some sort of restraint. There's a kind of restraining apparatus or a structure, and I think for cinema, it's very helpful because you do need to have the frame as a kind of it's a focal practice. It's a way to draw one in, but at the same time, perhaps when it's done well, the frame it's always got an excess. It's always got a surplus, something that can't be restrained or contained within the frame, but is alluded to, that the idea that it could be a small frame, but that, there's a world, you're aware that it has a relationship to the world that's kind of spilling out, that it's more than the frame. And, this is kind of something that I like about cinema in particular, is that, it doesn't just put everything into the frame, nest everything in there and say the world can be contained. It can be reproduced fully as it is. It says, no, it can't be. We can try to kind of capture it, but there's always stuff spilling out. And it does a kind of faithfulness and a sort of respectful acknowledgement of that everything is more than the representation is able to kind of catch. And yeah, I was thinking about that, Irina, with your, just as a tangent, the swing. The swing is such a beautiful symbol and such a beautiful experience. And in your essay, you had a quote from this Irigaray, where she talks about how the swing is where you remember air, which is such a lovely, evocative turn of phrase. And it's so true with the swing. And it's not something you would ever associate with the city, which is all, it's very grid and corners and earth and confining architecture. You don't really think about the air so much, but the swing kind of reintroduces this to remember that there is this space outside of, the immediate structure, that there is like this room for play of excess, of surplus. And it's enjoyed there, the possibility of it in the square. So I don't know if you want to speak to that as well.
Thank you. If I may to take, I'll take liberty of sharing one more image, which I love so much. It's first on Arbor Moscow's website. It's their home page, and you can see how they are zooming out of that particular square, which they reconstructed with swings on the right. And yes, it is indeed a square, but their original idea was of this public square was really not a place to feel at home in, and the idea was a courtyard right? Which was so different from others' ideas and other ideas. And indeed, how does one recreate that sense of a courtyard in a walk-through square, right? And basically almost like a corridor that it used to be. And structurally, the fact that they managed to achieve that people feel that way, I think it can only be potentially arrested by the wider context, right? The political and inhospitality of how, and here maybe we also want to discuss a little bit how those welcoming moments are fragile. And I thought, Sara, in your presentation, that it's how that one man in the video where you're showing how he pushed the cat, it was like he pushed the cat away gently, but at the same time, right, that human-animal encounter is so precarious.
Yeah, Irina, that slide you just showed reminds me of Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames. I don't know if you've seen it, but they start at a picnic in Chicago, a lakeside picnic, and then sort of zoom out. I think it's 10 times every 10 seconds. And it's, it's quite humane in the way it starts at that very intimate scale, and then, works out. So you have that in your mind, and particularly as you zoom way out, and then it zooms it back in relatively quickly. So it's that clarity of home and where we live and what we occupy. But yeah, that's a beautiful way to open a architecture firm's webpage. It's really, it is also welcoming in that way.
Thank you. I'll check it out.
And so I'll zoom out now a little bit. I think I think in thinking anew about questions of hospitality, one of the biggest theoretical challenge that I feel is to free hospitality from the home, to free it from the home in so many ways. The home as a site of utter violence for many people who have, who have to be in the home, mostly women. Also, a site that's connected, intricately to property and to forms of sovereignty. So what I thought was really interesting in all of your work was that you're all sort of approaching this question of how can we free hospitality from the home to think about it anew. And, I think what's really interesting, Sara, your notion of the kind of feral, I think does that. Irina, the fact that you're kind of transplanting the living room into the city, kind of doing a reversal, not the home, but the living space in the city. And Charlie as well, we're sort of in this no man's land, or this place that's outside of all categories, and what can we learn from those, from spaces like that. So yeah, if you could tell me about, or is that something that matters to you, and where's your thinking on that operation freeing hospitality from the home?
That was pretty central for my project, because I felt that, and this was driven home, pardon the pun, during the pandemic, where I realized, that the home very much is or the house, the human dwelling place is not just the house. The house is not enough. It is a place, it can be a place of violence. It could be a place of inhospitality. Or it can be a sanctuary, even at, in the best case scenario, it is a retreat from the world, and that is not enough. And so there is a real need to create public spaces for us to negotiate with one another. These are spaces of possibility that we need to kind of extend past the house. And I think sometimes we keep trying to reproduce the the metaphor of the house in our encounters in public or in, restaurants, for example. I mentioned that I had worked for many years in restaurants where, I was expected to be a host and to welcome people no matter what, because I was working in the restaurant. I didn't own the restaurant, and having to kind of negotiate that kind of hospitality, so that, people have an expectation. I'm the guest, so you have to treat me as such. And, me being like, well, no, actually, you are a guest in my space, but I can decide whether or not I, give you service. It's not, the space doesn't determine, it doesn't circumscribe the nature of the hospitality. It's in the negotiations, which are what produce the possibility for us to be in the world, get along with each other or not. That's always at risk, but it needs to be taken outside of the house, and it allows us to be more present and more active in the creation of our communities. So
yeah, Sarah, I like what you were saying about renegotiate and negotiate, and I was thinking about that image that you showed of the cat just to the side of the door. I think you said swimming, kind of scratching on the glass. I love that. For me, as a maybe a emblem of that kind of renegotiation. And at Slab City, I think, in a similar way, people who live there have to rely on the land itself and have to sort of rethink that relationship. And because it's so difficult and often the land is inhospitable, have to renegotiate the relationships with each other. And it doesn't always, it's not idealistic, and it doesn't always necessarily go well, but it does require a certain reliance on that, which is in a way a deepening of a sense of community. And again, it doesn't happen all the time, but there's something there about that kind of communication and the underlay of a kind of freedom.
And to pick up from Sara and Charlie, I think it's such an important question. It's a profound question, because hospitality is so much tied to the issue of interiority and welcoming into somewhere what one considers one's own, right? Whether it's a territory, whether it's indeed one's own space, intimate space, like currently we're doing on Zoom during this pandemic. And here, today's discussion about the role of architecture in this is interesting, because I find, and Charlie, please let's correct me if I'm wrong, I do not think that architecture necessarily spent decades and decades of welcoming me, right? I don't think so. Or those people whom Charlie, you talked about, right? As a profession, I don't know. And that's why I find Bureau Moscow's work so different, so radically different. I don't think only within the Russian context, because it kind of challenges a lot of these separations, but also I feel it goes directly to the level of the body, right? And that is something potentially also to unpack. And indeed, Sylvie, you're so right that those neat separations where hospitality theory started, right? We have this beautiful romanticized notion of the feminine and the maternal, and this kind of feelings of being at home with oneself, and then there is a reality of the one who is rarely even acknowledged as being pretty much absent from the whole picture when it comes to philosophy and culture and architecture too. And here I'm wondering what also can be is architectural education changing? How does the profession itself can reconsider itself in relation to that?
Yeah, Irina, those are great questions, and they're questions that I think we have been grappling with, but we certainly now are intensifying that, and as we should have probably long ago. And that's why I love that Lena Bobardi quote that you drew from Buro Moscow's website. I think it is a great kind of frame, not only for practice but also for education.
Yeah, and I think some of the work that or a model for me in thinking through this is the work that Donna Haraway has been doing on, taking apart the notion of family and putting forth the notion of kinship, right? And thinking through the social, political, legal, economic implications of all of that. What does it mean when we decide that we, relate to each other in a very different way that is not biological in the ways that we think about. So I think, how do we apply or the same sort of questions to this thing called a home? How do we open it up? So for me, that's, and the work of Rua Benjamin as well, I think really important, questions of surrogacy and all of that. And of course, Irina, you've been talking about that for a long time already. I guess my last question, one of the things that was striking to me was that both Irina and Sara, so Moscow and Istanbul, are contexts of totalitarianism, right? So we have very precarious political situations, and in some way also, Charlie, I mean, it's a very precarious situation because you're outside of the law in some way. So if we can maybe think about that, what are we learning from these kind of exceptional situations that are very contemporary?
Well, I guess I will go ahead. I did think a lot about that during my research and my thinking, and how to kind of reconcile, again, much like Sara Swain did when she was making her film. How do I make a film about cats when so much is going on in Istanbul? The totalitarian regime of Erdogan, and the kind of the gentrification, the ways in which the city is becoming increasingly rigid and inhospitable to its inhabitants. And again, not to turn away from that chaos by looking at cats, but to see them as part of that. And if anything, I think there is a sense that there is an importance of focusing on what can't be circumscribed, what can't be overtaken by, politics and totalitarian regimes, what can't be fully absorbed into it. And so there's a real necessity, I think, to focus on the things that elude capture. And I think those things are, the willingness and the need to connect with other human beings, and not to kind of, and to connect with other kinds of life, to remind us that, I guess, deprivation reduces us all to creatures, and we're all just struggling to survive, and that this is something the animal can bring back to us in a way that reminds us that we are all animals struggling to make ourselves at home here, and we actually do require each other. And even if we're not talking about very serious issues, even if it's something like, with the pandemic now, it's there's this, everyone's talking about rats like overtaking the cities, and what's happening here? And it's like, well, we have essentially built these environments as though rats don't exist. And so now they're coming in, and we've actually created these architectures that support them, that are invitational to them, that allow them to thrive. And so perhaps in imagining ourselves as kin, rats live amongst humans, and that's something that needs to be acknowledged. And if we want to keep them out and don't want to share spaces with them, then that should be something that we take care to address and set boundaries and things like that. So yeah, there is this sense of creatureliness and kin, and the way that we need to kind of think about those relations for very serious issues and maybe not so serious, I don't know. But that's, I think, I want to say about that.
I think for me, and I think both of my co-presenters today, we think together, I think about power quite a bit. And for me, indeed, this is a question of those forces that that sometimes it feels like living oneself at the level of I don't know, architectural practice or academic scholarship or curatorial practice, kind of feeling somewhat disempowered, or right, that we are just not able to change things, but on that a level of let's say a police state, what does one do with that, right? Or this sovereignty, the question of violence when a city is taken over by SWAT teams and the likes of them around the world, whether it's Istanbul or Moscow. And so but I continue to be amazed at how that agency or resistances operate, and in the middle of when it looks like that all the structures have been put in place, by those who are powerful and who have violence on their side, right? Those apparatuses of violence on their side, that it's that kind of structure doesn't really exist, right? Of a totalitarianism. So I would also be mindful that what we saw last summer in many parts of the world is, not something to be discarded, right? In the cities around the world. And
yeah, and one thing I think I saw in the chat come up, Margaret Crawford's Everyday Urbanism, and that reminded me of, and this is maybe specific to Slab City in some ways in its context, but I think also a part of urban life in some ways is the how daily life affords moments of creative resistance, and at Slab City that kind of improvisations and creative resistance sort of also meets a resilience, or attempts at being resilient, which I think has in some ways lessons for how we build and how we make places as well.
Okay, we have a couple of more minutes. So last question, either from the panelists or from the audience. And if not, we hope that you will join us next week on March the 18th for the next conversation, which is around curatorial hospitality. And it is at 6 p.m. Eastern time, and you can find the information in the chat. So thank you very much, Irina, Charlie, and Sara, and thanks for the audience, to the audience for joining us today, and we will see you again next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvie.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.